Payments in CenterPoint is used to enter your cash purchases, whether you are printing a computer check or entering a handwritten check or adding to an ACH payment. The payment screen is also used to enter your line of credit purchases or to pay open vendor invoices. Let's go to a payment screen under Processes, Purchases, and Payments. A large amount of your entries are selecting items from your various setup lists, beginning with your company. The company is blank. If you have only one company in your data, it might be filled in. We can either type in a couple of characters to pick the company we want, or we can click the lookup, the magnifying glass, to do a lookup of what's in that particular list and select the item. Whenever you have an item from a lookup list, you can right click and there'll be several different menu options that you can that will help you. One of them that's handy in the company and the bank account is set as default. So if you have more than one company and you typically do entries for one particular company, you can select that company and select set as default. What that means is the next time you open up the entry screen, it will automatically fill in that particular company. And then the same way with the bank. We have a bank, First Bank, and I selected that. And I can, again, set that as the default if that's the bank account I typically use in my payment screen. Every one of your entry screens will have a different default that it remembers. If you later don't want that as a default any longer, you can right-click and clear the default, and that would clear it and leave the field empty, or you can make a different selection and set it as a default. Tab key moves to your next fields after I selected my bank account. Over in the right is my current balance for that particular bank account for that company. And in the far upper right is my current batch. It will default to no batch, meaning that this particular transaction is not in a batch. When I save this transaction, it's automatically going to post it and do whatever print options that I've selected. If I don't want this to actually post at this time, I want several transactions in a batch and I want all of them to post at one time and print at one time, then you can add a batch. And I could right-click in that field and click New and make a new batch, and then use that same batch for all the transactions that I want to post in that particular batch. That batch then would just, the transaction saved to the batch, and it doesn't post until you go to Processes and Batch Transactions and choose to post that batch. I'm going to now tab to my next field, which is paid to the order of, and this will be the vendor that I'm going to be paying. So again, I can do my lookup of my magnifying glass and do a lookup here. If I needed to make a new item here, I can. I have buttons at the bottom where I could create a new name if I needed to. If this was a name that I know I'm never going to probably use again, I can use the option of new one-time use. That'll bring up a smaller entry screen where all I need is the name if needed, and then save that. What happens on a new one-time use name is that name becomes automatically inactive. So it will print, if I'm printing a check, it'll print on this check, but then it won't be on my active list to be on my name list for future reference unless I show all. So I'm going to select a name here. I have a name for all power equipment. So I could either type in all and it would find it, or I could type in power and it would find that transaction. I'm going to right click again in this field for the name, and I have more right click options here. So from the right click option, I can also do new. I could edit the selection that I'm currently have in the field and make any changes and resave it if I needed to. I can, again, set as default, but you're probably not going to do that in your pay to the order of. I could review transactions. If I click that, it will bring up the transactions that I've done to that particular name in the date span that I've got defined at the top. And I can also set how I want transactions to behave for this particular vendor. So there are different options here. To leave the transaction empty means that nothing's going to be filled in down at the bottom of the grid when I select this name. If I select to recall last transaction, then when I select that name, it's going to retrieve the last transaction I did to this particular name for that company. And if I choose to load default reoccurring, then that means that I've set a reoccurring transaction for this particular name, and it would automatically bring in that reoccurring transaction. So those are different things that you can do from your name field. And on all of your different lookup items, there's also a toggle between showing all items or show only active items. So right now, it would be showing all of my names. And if I toggle again back to show only active items, it's going to only show my active items. You can also do that change from here of unchecking show only active or checking it. The other option are some lookup options. Contains means that if I type in, I have a name out here, let's center, and a couple of names that start with CenterPoint. But if I switch this to my option of contains instead of begins with, and I type in center, it brought up more things because I've got a couple of names out there that have center within the name. So that's what those two options will do. If it has begins with, then it will first look for names that begin with, and if it doesn't find it, then it'll go look for names that have it within the name. But if you have contains, then it will bring up all of those items, whether it begins with it or it is contained. So those are just some preferences that you would have on how you want that to happen. And then again, there are some other options for how you want the lookup to respond, and there is a video on doing lookups too to help you with that. Once you've selected your name, it fills out the address that is in the detail of that particular name. And I could change which address I wanted. If there were other addresses and I wanted a shipping address here, I can change that from my address type here, my description. I'm going to tab now to my next field, and it's bringing up the sequence that is the default sequence for the bank account that I selected. And there are different sequences that you can have too for this particular entry screen. In this case, I have one for a line of credit or an EFT or my payments. You might have another one that was a handwritten check perhaps. The sequence is managing what gets filled in on my next check number. So it found that my last one was 3151, and now it's bringing in 3152. And I could change that if I wanted to also. And then I'm going to my date. The date is going to go to the system date or the last day of the last month that has been opened up in CenterPoint. And then I'm going to go to my amount. So you can leave the amount empty if you don't know what the total amount is, and what you're paying is maybe a combination of a couple of different invoices that you're putting in, amounts that you're putting in, and you don't know the amount, you can leave it blank, and adjust amount later will fill that in for you. If I fill that in right now with an amount, then that is what is going to default to the first line of my grid. Okay, and then I'm going to go to my next field. The memo lines will print on your check, at the actual check, and is typically used for an account number, which I've already defined in this particular vendor. I've put in a memo of this account number and it came into line 2. If there were another memo that I wanted for this particular check, I could put that in the memo line 1. And then I'll tab to the apply to open invoice. If this particular vendor had open vendor invoices assigned to it, then this button would be highlighted in yellow, and I could click that button and choose to pay those open invoices from the payment screen. Your open invoices can also be paid from pay invoices due. I don't have any open invoices here. I'm going to go right to my grid, where I'm going to select what is this particular purchase is for. In your grid for your transaction entry here, you can customize what fields you want to see on the front screen. If I right-click, there are some right-click options of add remove column, or I could delete a row if I enter a row later and I want to delete it. Or this will be, actually I'm on the invoice reference number, that repeat previous value will be used if you put an invoice reference number in and you're entering several different journals for this payment, and you want that same number to be entered on each line. That's what the repeat previous value will do. So on our add remove columns, I'm going to bring that up, and that will list all of the different columns that I could display on my front screen. And so if I wanted to, if I decide that, you know, most of the time I want to see the production center perhaps, or I want to see associated account because I use that for repairs quite often. I can add those fields. I can also then move them to where I want. So if I want production year up further, like after the amount, and profit center up further, I can change my different fields here. Maybe I want notation up before that. I can move whatever I want to move here. And the first selection that you'll have to do is your account of what this is for. So again, I have the same kind of lookup options that I can set for looking up my account. So I typed in REP and it brought up all of the accounts that start with that. And I'm going to choose that this is my repair expense for equipment. And I could put an invoice number in here, and quantity is optional. If I wanted, if this particular item applied for quantities, I could enter a quantity, and then I get to the amount. So if this were for a couple of different things, I can change this amount here, and it will default the remaining amount of the amount I started with minus this to the next line. And I can put my notation in here of it was a tire repair or whatever that was, and what profit center, but in this case it looks like I don't need my profit center information because I have a distribution assigned. If my distribution button is orange with a title in it, that's indicating that a distribution is assigned to this particular account. And I don't need to worry about any of my production details there. You can always click the detail button. That will bring up your detail screen with other fields that are available for that particular entry for doing an increase of an expense. And then I could, on this particular case, go to my associated account, and maybe this was for a tractor, we'll say. It goes then to my next line, and if this was for only one thing, I would be able to save this, and I would have had this at 500. But we're going to say that we also did some supplies here. I'll do farm supplies. And we got the same number. Now, again, if we had done repeat previous value, that would have brought in our invoice reference number there. And then I'm going to go on, and I'm done with this transaction. And this particular transaction, then down at the bottom, are our buttons for saving. And first we're going to want to review what the print options are here. So if we click the print option, this particular vendor is set up to do an ACH payment. So this, the agreement we've made with this vendor is that instead of writing him a check, printing a check, and sending a check to him, we're going to pay him through an ACH file. So this would get added to the ACH file, and then that ACH payment would get done later when we're ready. So we've indicated that if we and add to ACH file will give you this symbol of ACH with a green check mark. If we didn't need to print this at all, maybe it was a handwritten check and we are not going to print at all or do ACH, then we could do not print. It would come to a red X with a printer. Or if we do a print check and we're going to this printer, then it would be a printer with a green check mark. So when I save it, then it would go directly to my printer that I selected right there, and I would want to make sure that my check form was in the printer at that time. We're going to leave this at ACH. And these other two buttons are if you want to scan a document and attach it to this transaction. We have something that is related to this particular entry and we want to save it to that entry. We could scan it, it would go directly and be attached to this transaction. Or I can attach a document that's existing on your computer that you want to save to this by clicking the paperclip and then go and attach that file. And there is also another video on attaching documents to your transactions. Then next, down at the bottom of the screen are your different buttons for saving the transaction. If I click save, this will automatically post the transaction because there's no batch. It'll automatically post it and then print or save to my ACH in this case. If I click clear, that will clear everything back to nothing selected in this particular transaction, so I can start over. If this were let's click clear here, and I'll show you this. If this were a transaction where I want to recall the last transaction, then I pick the vendor and I click recall, and it brings back the last transaction that I've done to that particular vendor. Where now I can make any changes here if I wanted to, and I'm ready to click save. Reoccurring is if I have an entry made and I want this entry to be used routinely, then I would click the reoccurring button and give it a description of, maybe I'll call it all power. And if this were the case where I always use repair expense equipment for this particular vendor, then I would save this as a reoccurring. So that next time when I come back and select all power equipment, this transaction is going to get filled out, but no amount. When you click recall, it'll bring back the amount also. If you click recurring, then that means that the details that you had in here and the account are what you typically want, but the amount is going to change. And then your options have some other options here. I can review transactions, which brings up the last 10 transactions that I've done with this particular company and bank account. Or I can do custom field comments where I have had some preferences made where I'm using custom fields, and if you're doing that, then those custom fields will be listed here and you could enter your custom comments. Recall by company, you can do your recall by company or by company bank account. So if you wanted just to recall the combinations of the company bank account, then you would choose that option. And I can set my tab stops. So on my tab stops where it goes field to field, you have an option to undo some of these if you don't want to stop there and make your entry tabbing through the screen a little quicker. Like perhaps I don't want it to stop at memo field all the time. I don't typically put anything in myself, or I don't want it to stop at apply to open invoice. So I'll show you what that would do. If we come back over here to date, my tab is going to go to amount, and then it went right to repair. You can see this time it skipped over both memos and the apply to open invoice. So a little bit more of a shortcut in doing your data entry. And then if I refresh, that would refresh anything that I've changed in my setup here, and I might want to refresh that screen. There is also in your entry screen, if you want to, if you've made several different entries and you want to order them different than what it came up, because every entry you put in, it'll go in the order that you entered it. If I again put in my farm, sorry about that, farm supplies, and I put in 200 here, and I'm going to click adjust amount. Adjust amount will then adjust my amount that I put in my subdivisions here to my amount up at the top of the screen. And if I said that, oh, I really wanted this one to print out on the top line instead of the second line, if you right click and add a column for line sequence, that adds your line sequence, and it makes each line in here 10, 20, and then it would be 30, 40. But if perhaps I wanted this one to be first before the repair line, and I wanted supplies to be first, I could put like an 8 here, and then click my refresh, and it reordered those. So after I've done this entry, and if you're trying to match it up with something else printed that you're wanting to refer to, then that line sequence will help you get the order that you want before this is posted. And this would be how it would print on the check stub also. So those are some different things that you can do. When you click save, if it happened to be that your total subdivisions at the bottom is different than the amount that you started with, you're going to get a warning. Let's put in one more here, and I'll show you if right now my total at the bottom is 853 and my amount at the top is 843. If I click save, it came up and said that the total of subdivisions does not equal the amount entered at the total of the transaction. Do you wish to accept the amounts entered in the subdivisions? If you say yes, then it's automatically going to make the total amount of the transaction 853. If you say no, then it will just come back and let you make your correction of what might be wrong, and then you'll be able to click save again. So I am ready to save, and that has added this particular payment to my ACH file.